Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in.
This week, we will continue our discussion on the impact and response of the COVID-19 pandemic with AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure as always.
How was your 4th of July weekend?
Had a great 4th of July weekend. Did some traditional grilling and dinner, and then watched the fireworks from the roof of our condominium building. And it was a spectacular display.
Yeah. I pretty much did the same thing. Watched it from my porch, threw on some burgers on the grill, and had a good time. So
Yes.
It was a good power down weekend. Congress is out for the next 2 weeks. But we know that the UI supplement is expiring on the 31st. We've talked about that on this podcast. So they have a short window once they come back to get a deal done on the next COVID-19 aid package. So I want to go through some of the ideas being discussed for our listeners.
Sure.
First, let's talk about the obvious, which is the UI supplement. AAF has a good amount of research out there on the work disincentives that come with the UI supplement at the current payment level. Where do negotiations stand now, and where do you think Congress will land on this issue?
Well, just to refresh people's memories, the federal government for the first time provided a supplemental unemployment insurance benefit to augment the state level benefits that have always been in the UI system. And it's $600 a week, or roughly $15 an hour for a 40-hour work week, which is an extraordinarily generous amount of money. As it turns out, in the calculations that Isabel Soto's done for AAF, this means that roughly 2/3 of workers make more on UI than they would going back to their previous job. It's also true in the state local sector as well, which I'm not sure is as widely appreciated. So there are employment disincentives across the board here that need to be dealt with if we're really going to get people back to work. So Congress doesn't like cliffs, so it's unlikely they'll just let it go away. And instead, most of the conversation revolves around a lesser amount, so scale it back somehow, 300, 200, 400. We will see how the sausage making works out, and in some cases, perhaps try to do it as a percentage of the state UI benefits. If you do that, it varies with the wage is in the area, which is probably a good idea. The flat 600 is a lot more money in some places than others. You could have it vary with wage levels, and also with the pay on your previous job. So UI is bigger for those who had more high-paying jobs. So that's where they are, and that's 100,000 miles away from an agreement. So the issue remains. It will likely get settled when it has to get settled, not one instant before. And stay tuned.
I'm sure next week we will be sitting here talking about this, what's new in the negotiations, what's going on. So we will keep a close eye on all this. Where does the administration stand on this issue right now? I mean, they obviously are going to play a big role in negotiations because at the end of the day, the president has to sign this. So where do they stand?
Secretary Mnuchin has identified this as a problem and said, we know that we can't have this. It's got to change. That's as far as I think they've publicly gone. They have said politely nice things about various proposals out of the Senate, particularly Rob Portman's idea of a reemployment bonus. So let's give people money if they go back to work, without sort of specifically saying we want that in the bill. So I think they're basically talking quietly among all the parties on the Hill. The parties on the Hill are all over the map, and the cats need to be herded.
Yeah, what would be the danger of not extending this? Is there a significant danger of not extending something?
There's a danger. Significance is hard to quantify. There has been a lot of government transfers into the household sector. So there are the checks that we've heard so much about, but there's also these UI benefits, and we've got a record number of people applying for and receiving UI benefits. This then represents a cliff on the transfers into the household sector. So far, those transfers have kept the household sector essentially whole. In the aggregate, I can't say too much about specific households, but in the aggregate, households have $2 trillion more in the bank today than they had in February, despite the pandemic. And that's because a whole bunch of cash has gone in there. So if you're worried about traditional demand issues, like, do people have the wherewithal to spend? They do right now, but if you have a cliff, maybe you get worried that some people will not in the fall. And that's what you're going to hear from economists on the left. They're concerned about an income cliff coming at the end of July.
Okay, so obviously Congress is likely to include other ideas in their next aid package. So let's talk about some of those. What are some of the main sticking points between the parties as they discuss the next aid package?
The two lightning rods, one on the Republican side, Mitch McConnell's insistence that there be some sort of protection for businesses against liability of lawsuits due to employees contracting COVID-19 and asserting it came in the workplace. He wants essentially blanket protection against that. For how long? There are lots of issues associated with that. Like, even if you would think it's a good idea, for how long do you want to do that? Well, maybe just during the period of the emergency declaration by the president. The minute he removes that emergency declaration, the protection goes away. So that's one that's there. Democrats have just flatly said no way. It's just said no way we're going to have a bill unless it's in. So that's that. On the other side, it's how much money do you give state and local governments? Where the ask by the Democrats in the Pelosi bill that went through the House but will not go forward in the Senate, the amount given to the state and local governments in that is a bit more than McConnell has indicated the price tag for the entire next piece of legislation should be. So they're pretty far apart on how much money needs to go in there. So those are two big sticking points right now.
Yeah. So what you're saying is going to be an eventful 2 weeks. A lot's going to change, and we're just going to have to follow what's going on.
Or it'll be an uneventful 2 weeks because we don't see what's going on. But with a deadline, you can be sure they will be pedaling pretty fast. And I think then there's the question of what else goes in there. And as is usually the case when people identify the last train leaving the station before Congress goes away for the election, everything under the sun gets mentioned as trying to ride onto this vehicle. And that usually means that you get some sort of fairly ugly process where something is holding it up that has nothing to do with the pandemic. And then they all agree, no, none of these things are going to happen. They throw them all off and they pass a sort of more targeted bill. And that would be the right outcome in my view.
The typical legislative process these days. Yeah. Like, what about stimulus checks? Do you think those will end up in some way in the next aid package?
For the reasons I just outlined, household sector seems to be in pretty good shape from that perspective right now. It seems to me that's not something they need to do, and it might be wise to hold on to that firepower for later if it becomes necessary. As usual, when I say things like that, most likely it's going to be in there. Because the president has repeatedly said he's open to the idea and likes the idea of sending more checks, and so that's the one place the White House has landed pretty forcefully, and the House Democrats aren't going to oppose that. You're going to have some reservations by Senate Republicans on budgetary and other grounds, but my guess is something ends up in there.
So you've also talked a lot about one of the big issues of reopening the economy is safe workplaces. And you've made the point that we have to start thinking about how we operate the economy in the face of this virus. Several news outlets have picked up one of your ideas, and that's to offer tax credits to offset the employer's cost to make the workplace safe. I even saw Congressman Kevin Brady discussing this idea, and you've sent out some tweets about it as well. What is your thinking behind this proposal?
So this goes back to my experience at the White House and the Congressional Budget Office after the terrorist attacks of 2001. In the aftermath of those attacks, we got disappointing economic performance. And even though Congress passed traditional stimulus in 2002, 2003, 2005, and ultimately 2008, they sent out checks. And in retrospect, it seemed to me that one of the things that happened was every business in America was trying to make themselves safe against the threat of terrorism. And indeed, the country as a whole was. We set up the TSA to make sure people got screened before they got on planes. We set up procedures to inspect every cargo container coming into the U.S., which was very expensive and not previously had ever been done. We put bollards around every building. Like now you can't go around buildings without seeing ballers and a whole variety of other things. And so we spent an enormous amount of money on the safety mission. It was expensive for businesses. That expense came instead of hiring and instead of investing in faster growth through more productive investments. Seems to me we could run into the same thing again now. We have a threat, and the threat makes workplaces unsafe, and you have to find a way to make your workplace safe, or you can't get the workers to come back, and that will be an expensive proposition. So if you think, a bodega in Brooklyn, which is everyone's favorite example, it's unlikely that they are going to be able to completely, revamp their store. So they're going to have to come up with a bunch of PPE to protect their workers and sterilize all the time, and that'll be an expense for them, not something they wouldn't normally do. Or airflow will be a big deal. So got to buy big fans or change your HVAC, whatever it may be. Bigger companies are going to spend money on the physical workplaces, like spreading out desks, moving production lines, running more shifts with half the people. All these things are expensive. And if you do nothing, you raise the cost of doing business. That's typically bad for the pace of growth. It's going to inhibit their capacity to hire people back and or add new people. And so my idea is, to the extent possible, can you offset legitimate reconfiguration expenses and protection expenses through some sort of, in this case, a tax credit that you use against your payroll taxes. So instead of sending some money into the treasury for payroll tax, you use that to cover these costs. That lowers the cost of adjusting to this way of doing business and makes it more likely we can get people back quicker. That's the idea.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of some of the essential businesses out there, like your grocery stores and things like that, already take steps to sort of prevent this, which to make the workplace safe, which is, making sure like every other register is being used, or having like the plexi shields in place to make sure that people aren't. So I imagine it'll be a lot of that depending on what your business is and what you need to do to get employees back.
Yeah, I think it's how big it would be, not obvious to me. Could be actually a pretty big price tag on that. And from the perspective of sort of thinking of the bipartisanship, what that also means is somebody's getting paid to do that. So this is actually a big stimulus for particular sectors of the economy, suppliers of those goods and services, construction, installation people, things like that. So those are places where it would be appealing to get people back to work as well.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, with as we mentioned, Congressman Kevin Brady was already talking about it. What do you think the appetite is for something like this on Capitol Hill?
I think in isolation, it's probably not popular enough to make it over the finish line. But as part of a larger package, there's some chance it'll be included. It's not the way most people think about the problem, right? Mm-hmm. They think about this as just gotta have demands, gotta give people checks and all that. And they think of the safety issue as exclusively getting a vaccine. I think it's just more realistic to imagine the middle ground where you don't have the vaccine, you still have to do business.
Fair enough. So turning to another issue, what about, we sort of started talking about this earlier, but what about the federal aid to state and local governments? There's been a ton of news this week from state and local governments saying that they're going to have to make big budget cuts unless they receive federal aid, just because they're not getting in the revenue that they need to make their obligations. Where do you think Congress will come down on this?
I don't know what the number is, and I'll be honest about that. We know from a piece I did a little while back, I just went and looked at the employment declines in the state and local sector, and they've really been quite dramatic. They've been more rapid and bigger than they were in 2008, like everything is now. And that was, back in April. Right? It happened fast. So if now they're running out of money, they got to put it off by laying some people off and probably save some money in between. So I think there's no question their revenues have gone away like everyone else's have, and they're going to face budgetary difficulties. I don't think there's any question about that. The question is, how do you gauge the magnitudes? And, I've seen things from, $2 trillion down to $350 billion. So the range seems quite wide right now. And, I had always wondered how much of this problem could be dealt with by using the Federal Reserve's municipal liquidity facility and taking loans out to cover the revenue shortfall, which you would pay back in better times. Those loans have 4-year lives. Doesn't look like there's a lot of appetite for that. We haven't seen a big move there, so they're counting on Congress writing them a check.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as some of the big problems here? I mean, what are some of the big problems with the federal bailout of state and local governments?
So there are just really 3 different kinds of problems that states have, and one is additional costs they face because of the COVID-19 pandemic. EMTs and first responders and the health sector costs and all of that. That's real and is straining their budgets. The second is the revenues have gone away. That's a very real issue and straining their budgets. And those are legitimate places for Congress to step in and decide how much it wants to help. And then the third, which is the what makes this issue complicated, is there are states who are in trouble because they have put themselves in trouble even prior to the pandemic. And they have pension plans that are underfunded, and they have other sort of structural problems with their budget. And there's agreement, I think, that this is not the time and place for the federal government to fix that, if there ever is going to be one. Probably shouldn't be. But where do you err? And, some people want to err on the side of generosity and run the risk of actually, in part, subsidizing those structural problems. Others are like, no, that's not going to happen. I want to make sure we don't. And so they're going to be less generous. So that's the pull in this one. It pulls one direction for every day.
What else should we be paying attention to that may or will be in the next package?
Oh, I think those are the big ones. I mean, you got checks, you have liability, you have state, local governments. There may be some other things in there in the UI piece, but those are the big moving pieces, and the rest is all smaller ball stuff. I have things I think might be important, but I think that's going to be part of the legislative process, just how much you can get through.
Mm-hmm. Turning to something we got last week, which is, of course, the June job report numbers. What do these numbers tell us about the economic recovery?
Well, I think they tell us really good news. I mean, millions and millions of people getting jobs. When we got the 20 million job loss in April and was, just a mind-blowing experience, you'll remember that 18 million were identified as temporary layoffs. And what I think we learned in the combined May and June reports is that, there were a lot of people out there who could readily come back if conditions quickly improved, and they did. And so that's the good news. That's the low-hanging fruit. The more we can do of that, the better. Even with millions and millions of people back, we were still well below where we were in February, and so we have a long way to go still. So that I think that was all quite favorable. That report was done during the week that contains June 12th, and so it was early in the month, and in the second half of June we got the flare-ups and the regional lockdowns, and so the real issue is what kind of risks do we face in the July report? Will we see slower improvements or not? And so everyone's looking toward that with some interest. A second report came out just this past Tuesday, which is called the JOLTS report, the Job Opening and Labor Turnover Survey, JOLTS. And what we found in that was in June, the 1.8 million people lost their jobs. So there were, and that, as it turns out, is roughly the level we had in January and February. So we're back to the normal level of sort of turnover in the labor market. There's always jobs being created, jobs being destroyed. We get 4 or 5 million sort of transitions every month, and we were back to that. So that's good news. We're not destroying jobs anymore at the pace we were certainly in March and April, where jobs were getting killed at extraordinary rates. Mm-hmm.
Certain states are pulling back on reopening the economy. I saw yesterday that unfortunately a couple of chains had to file for bankruptcy. How might some of those issues play a negative role in our economic recovery? Have we seen any of the troubling numbers on this front yet?
Well, I think what we are seeing pretty clearly is targeted lockdowns. We haven't had broad stay-at-home orders. We've said, bars probably not a good idea. Let's close the bars. Let's close the beaches. Let's sort of dial back the capacity for in-restaurant eating and stay outside, or and those, that tells me that it is to be expected that the economy will not recover at the same rate. Leisure and hospitality will recover at a slower rate. Airlines are going to recover at a slower rate. That's going to be what we see over the next year. That's not good news if you're in that sector, that's for sure. And it also says that we are likely to have a different economy in 2021 than we had at the beginning of 2020. It's going to have a smaller footprint in those areas, a bigger footprint elsewhere. Streaming services are going to be bigger. Delivery services are going to be bigger. We've already seen that. It's going to continue, unlikely otherwise. And so that's a traditional event during a recession and recovery. So you reshape the economy for the future, and we'll see that. And so the lockdowns accelerated.
To your point on streaming services, just as an aside, I saw, I think it was, over the past couple of days when Disney Plus released Hamilton, that Google searches for how do I get Disney Plus went, skyrocketed above all the other streaming services. So, anecdotal evidence to your point about, changes in the economy and how people are looking at things. But I found it very interesting.
And we saw, Brooks Brothers file for bankruptcy, announced they're going to file for bankruptcy. And again, we knew that a lot of brick and mortar retail was in trouble prior to the pandemic. This accelerates it dramatically. The fact that it happens in the pandemic makes it no less painful. There's always some economic pain associated with these transitions, and we're going to witness that in the next couple of months.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one final topic today. We saw with Unified Agenda that the Trump administration appears to be shifting from a deregulation to a regulation mode. Our regulatory policy team recently noted that there have been more than 900 regulatory actions related to COVID-19, many of which have been deregulatory in nature. What are you seeing here?
So the Unified Agenda is the plan for the regulatory authorities in the executive agencies. And what the regulation team, Dan Bosch and Dan Goldbeck, did was go through what they announced they were planning to do and look only at major regulations, those that cost $100 million or more, and then classify them into or have an impact of $100 million or more, classify them into deregulatory, going down, or regulatory, going up. And as it turns out, there are more going up than going down at this point. And so that's a switch from the previous 3 years, and suggests one of two things. Either they're running out of places where they can save money in the regulatory state, or two, they've lost their appetite for it. They're switching to other things. It's probably more the former than the latter, but that's where they are. I think the most important thing about the sort of big regulatory actions in the pandemic emergency is a lot of them are done with the emergency authorities. And so the poster child for this is improved telehealth services. They had the authority to do something that had never before been done, which is you could do telehealth from your home. Might seem silly, but you used to have to go to a telehealth place, which sort of defeated the purpose of telehealth. And so in the emergency, HHS said, nope, you can do it from your home. You can use a commercial streaming device, whether it's Zoom or Teams or whatever it may be. You don't have to have some dedicated one. And we will pay doctors the same for telehealth as they do for an office visit. That didn't used to be the case. So telehealth has boomed. But the moment the pandemic passes and the emergency goes away, it goes back to the old regulatory regime. So, you'd like to see some of these things made permanent, and that would be sort of a beneficial outcome. In this case, it would cost money because they would have to reimburse more highly. But I still think it'd be worth it. We're getting better service out of that. Yeah.
You've also noted that many times the administration's deregulatory actions have been one of their keys to economic success, and it's often overlooked. Do you foresee that if they do switch to a more regulatory front, that might hurt any economic recovery? What do you see on the remainder of this front?
Yeah, I guess qualitatively, the switch from the Obama era, roughly $100 billion a year in regulatory costs, to the Trump era, essentially zero every year, was a dramatic change, and it had a big impact, in my view, on the environment for economic growth. I don't see them switching from zero or small negatives to $100 billion. That's not the game plan. The mechanisms that they have in place require them to be honest about how much cost they're willing to impose, right? Because they give each agency a budget. This is how much cost you can impose on the private sector through your regulatory actions this year. The way they got the deregulation is those budgets were negative numbers or zeros. And if they have to turn around and hand out budgets that are, you get $1 billion of regulatory costs, you get $2 billion, they're going to impose across the government $10 to $15 billion in regulatory costs. That's still not back to the previous regime. And so I think the impacts will be relatively modest.
Fair enough. Well, Doug, thank you for taking the time today. This is a good discussion. And like I said, throughout the podcast, I'm sure we will be returning to some of these as, an aid package takes shape and as we get more numbers on the economy.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.